In front of me, I have a dynamic individual who has been paying it forward for years. She's a historian, an author, an educator, an archivist. Really and truly, she is probably one of our best gems in the city, Dr. Dorothy Williams. Dr. Williams, welcome everybody to Bhum Bhum Time.
Thank you. What a wonderful intro.
Phil, my dear love, honey boo, we've been talking about a lot of this stuff for close to 30 plus years, and finally we're working on a project together. And I go back to our very beginning when we were assembled, artists and people working, Black people working in the civil service, Crown agencies, and then it was Dale Anderson, the longest serving public service, and we were all in Ottawa talking about Black arts.
Yes, we were.
You were the editor of Word. I was a young publicist over at National Film Board, but we always talked about media and the arts. And here we are today, all working collaboratively on your brainchild, The Takeover. Tell me where you got the idea from. And for the listeners who, for the very first time, this is the time you're tuning in and you're hearing that for the past 4 days we've been doing The Takeover. Tell them what The Takeover is.
Well, first of all, thank you for that introduction. And I am so inspired right now to be able to share the room with Dr. Williams. And yourself, of course. We're talking about people with a great knowledge of Black history in Montreal. And, I don't take credit for the Canada Black Music Archives. It was co-founded by myself and Donna McCurvin, who's in the room here.
Oh, my goodness. Shame on me. Donna, apologies for not properly introducing you, but she's hiding behind something.
Donna is hiding. She doesn't want to be speaking. The speaking role seems to have fallen into my lap, so I get to publicly represent the organization. But, beside every successful male, there's usually a successful female.
Hear, hear.
I'm shutting my mouth because there's all sorts of things I could say, but I'm trying to stay formal and behave today.
All right. But yes, the Takeover has really been an opportunity to working alongside CKUT, which has had a great role to play in the rich history of Black music here in Montreal. The opportunity came about with the help of Dr. Mark Campbell, who's a professor at U of T in Toronto. And we became involved in this type of work. Mark was working on Northside Hip Hop, which was a project to document the rich history of hip hop music and culture in Canada. And we were looking at a wider story involving the many different genres of Black music, which often, get left out in many of the conversations. And so this became an opportunity to really do a deep dive, go to what I consider the sister city of Toronto in terms of Black music history, and to try to excavate as much as possible about this rich history. It's not going to be the first time. This is the first time, but I guarantee you that we will be coming back. You can't tell the story of Black music in Montreal in 1 week. That would not be possible. So we will be coming back. But while we're here, I was inspired to speak to Dr. Williams because of a great book that she's written. And that book, for those of you who don't know, is called The Road to Now, A History of Blacks in Montreal, 350 years of Black history in this town. And she does an amazing job of it. And the book, I'm told, is out of print. So if you can get a copy, hang on to it. Put it in your library. It's a keeper. All right. So I'd like to jump in because there's several questions that we'll be asking Dr. Williams. These are questions that Mark and I discussed and wanted to make sure that we were on point. Of course, the professor's here, and if you slip, you might get called out. So, I wanted to come correct. And the first question, I'll read it here so that you get the full measure of it. In Chapter 3, Dr. Williams, of your book, The Road to Now, A History of Blacks in Montreal, you briefly mentioned the ethnic tensions that existed between American, Canadian, and Caribbean Blacks in Montreal, exasperated, of course, as some of you may know, by the railway company's preference for African American labor. And the question is, do you think music may have played a role in dissolving some of those ethnic tensions among what was already a diverse Black population in Montreal?
What's so interesting about the question was the verb you use, because
I was going to ask.
This is truth-telling time now.
all right, we already started. I see that,
I see that.
because if you want to put a lens on that time, and I'm assuming you're talking in the 20s and the 30s,
Yes.
and maybe even a bit earlier before the union, the brotherhood was developed here, the sleeping car porters in Montreal. You really are talking about multiple layers of discord, if you will. It wasn't just about the railways themselves and their hiring preferences. And just for clarification, that was CP. They were going way hard for the African Americans. CNR was doing the opposite. They wanted just Canadian, right? As a charter company of the federal government, they saw it as their role to bring in Canadians as opposed to African Americans. And then they would have been in step with the government policy at that time, particularly as the Depression started to hit and the preference for Black labor, and not, because there was a backlash, to bring in African Americans to fill in jobs in Canada, right? Mm-hmm. So you had that tension going on, but you also had an ideological tension and also a class tension going on at the same time, because each of the groups that you mentioned there, and I do cover it in my book, was perceived in a different way in the social sphere. Right? And so they had a different class status based on their education or their potential, and also how they were perceived. And then there was the ideological differences that I think heightened the division, if you will, the tension between them. And one of them were the Garveyites versus those that felt that what Blacks needed to do was to catch that low-hanging fruit, the social service net, the safety net that we call our social service system now, was just beginning to come into play. And Blacks who were thinking in that regard were, hey, if the Irish can get unemployment, or they can get services from the government, whatever services they are, we pay taxes too, why can't we? Mm-hmm. And the Garveyites were of the mind, they don't want us, and I mean the they, mm-hmm. I'll say the dominant culture doesn't want us. Let's pool our resources and take care of our own. And two different ideological, and I'm simplifying it, okay? Mm-hmm. I understand it's a simplification, but I'm trying to break it down so that you can see that those also would have created a tension, right? And so that also, I do mention in my book, as I talk about how that played in with the NCC's development, particularly the NCC, yes. Because that broke the porters. You had some saying, yeah, we need a social service organization. Blacks need to have an organization to take care of their needs, right? Others saying, no, it's the man, right? And the fact that the railway companies were donating to the NCC meant that, in their mind, the NCC was in the pocket of their own employer who disregarded them as poor. So there's many, many, many issues at play. It's not as simple as that.
Okay.
But you want to get down to music? I'll tell you. The main tension that was going on, and I see that being played out in a class thing, because even though right now we kind of, what's the word? We glorify jazz and what jazz did for Black Montreal in its golden era. Not every person in the Black community thought jazz was the best thing from heaven. In fact, for many people, they saw it as the devil's music. Mm-hmm. They had incorporated or appropriated many white people's version or lack of understanding of what jazz really was and where it had come from and how it was being shared. So I'm kind of going into much more deeper than I think you needed, but you think any one of those, and this is where Black identity, it's multiple.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So it's not just one thing. We were not just a homogeneous group. There were many factors that played into social relations. You had the red caps versus the sleeping car porters, tips versus the salaried guys, all of these things. Some of them were insignificant depending on the person, but some were very significant to identity and their social relations with each other. Stop now.
Now, you did say not everybody embraced jazz.
Much.
No, that's not too much.
I feel like I'm saying too much.
We're riveted. We're riveted.
We are truly riveted. So how was jazz perceived back then? Was there an alternative to jazz that people were listening to? Because my limited understanding was that the golden age of jazz began in the 20s. And Montreal, through prohibition, played an increasingly larger role in the development of jazz music north of the border. True?
I'm not going to disabuse you of that, but I'm going to say, because you asked before, were there alternatives? Of course there were.
Gospel?
No. Classical music. When you learned music, particularly piano, and I'm not even talking to wind instruments, but particularly piano and string instruments, you were taught classical music theory. If you look back at the biographies of like our mainstay, Oscar Peterson, and he talks about that tension himself, what he preferred, but he learned his music, even though he knew jazz was there and he wanted to play jazz, and then he flipped jazz into swing. He had an incredible facility for classical music. So when he was actually being, evaluated, he was evaluated on his classical knowledge. And because he had a perfect ear, and because he could play, they were astounded. They would have been calling him a musical prodigy, but for classical music. So, when I think also of the Black families that had pianos in their homes.
In their homes, yes.
Yeah, and that was a big thing at that time, in 20s and 30s. June Bertley's thesis talks about that. And I also had probably grew up on the latter end of that, where it was absolutely imperative. We got a piano in the house, we were doing the scales, and we were doing, basically preparing ourselves for the classical exams here at McGill. But there was always that undercurrent that there was another music, an alternative music. So jazz was the alternative. And in fact, Oscar Peterson talks about negotiating to let his father to let him play jazz and to become a jazz pianist. It was not a given because, oh, now I'm going to get into professor mode, but
You are a professor.
yes, I am. But and I'm just touching on the bits and pieces, but I want you to see it in its fullness, okay?
But was jazz, the question for me is, at one point, jazz was considered the devil's music.
Yes, it was. Oh, yes, it was.
And that sentiment was shared in the Black community?
I said some. We were talking about what are the kinds of tensions
Yes.
that you could frame that period, right? It wasn't a full-scale embracing of this music called jazz. There were some in the community that identified it very clearly as not being the right music, the devil's music. And I don't know because I'm not a music historian, but I suspect the Africanness of it, the ness-ness, right, of it, they probably heard that. And of course, having been brought up as good Negroes, they were working their way into
Being accepted.
Exactly, to
Yes.
being accepted, if not assimilated,
Yes.
but being able to be integrated, right? And so you wanted to shed as much of that as you could. All right? And so I think that you need to think about that time in a much more complex way than it has always been portrayed.
Okay, Professor Dr. Williams. Now we're getting somewhere with our understanding. There was gospel at the time. Gospel has always been a huge component of Black life in Montreal. Where did that fit in?
Gospel music at the time, gospel music was relegated to the churches. And churches were incredibly important. I don't need to go into how many books and memoirs are written and theses have been written about how important the church was to the community at the time. And what was seen in the United States was also replicated in Montreal. Absolutely, no question about it. But again, that would have been, even to classical music, considered an alternative music. It was something done within a church, within a liturgy that people shared on Sunday. So it didn't have the same, what's the word, cachet? Okay, that did not have the same cachet. Not yet. It's coming.
Yeah,
But we're talking during the jazz period, right?
Yes.
The gold, okay, fine.
Yes, because
no, not yet.
my understanding is that there were some classically trained performers who made it a point to, while performing classical music, let's call it European classical music, wanted to drop in some of our own music into the mix. Did that happen back then too?
Whoa. Now, I'm not a music, again, I'm going to qualify. I'm not a music
Yes.
historian, so I haven't actually looked at it from that lens. But I find it interesting because when you have people that have come out of gospel music, Portia White and other people who are the singers,
Yes.
their roots are in gospel music. And they come into the public sphere with a totally different route. It's not the same as the jazz, what you would say is jazz pianist today.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure what they brought. Even Paul Robeson brought in all kinds of other
Yes.
things like opera and all. Anyway, I won't go into
And
that.
we have an exhibition in Toronto at the Archives of Ontario.
Okay.
One of the people that we profiled and focused on was Portia White. Now, Portia White spent her early years in Halifax. She went on tour at a time when not many Black women were going out on tour
Exactly.
as singers. But one of the things I learned about her is that she made it a point of duty, I guess, to throw some gospel in while she was singing European classical music. So there was an awareness that we got to give them some of our stuff. You know, and that oftentimes, if you're a classical music singer, an opera singer like she was, gospel was there.
But there are many forms of, I mean, if you love music for music's sake,
Yeah.
like Ropesman, you're going to play them all. You're going to play them all. And so you're using it to express who you are. And sometimes that's through what gospel music is trying to say. Other times it's country music because it's very rural. It's very like down to earth kind of lyrics. And then, hey, you want to reach the stars, move into opera too. So that's okay. But that's the difference between, I would say, in French we'd say a chanson, and what would be the need to entertain. The need to entertain is what, because it has to pay for itself.
Yes.
This is where jazz comes into the public sphere, right? So it becomes a form of entertainment rather than a message.
Yes, and you have a number of musicians. I would say a lot of the bebop musicians who rebelled in a way against jazz being seen strictly as entertainment. You know, the John Coltrane's of this world, even Miles Davis to some extent, really wanted to be taken seriously as musicians, the Dizzy Gillespie's. Do you know what I mean? So I understand the entertainment piece. They wanted to get past that and be taken seriously.
I hear you.
Question I want to ask as I sit here and I listen to you all. Is there a folk expression, a Canadian folk expression, Black folk expression? And I know I don't want to put you on the spot, but I know there are all sorts of music at the time. And I ask this because here in Quebec, we do know Félix Leclerc. We have some knowledge of Félix Leclerc's friendship with McPherson. I think it's Reginald McPherson, who was the editor of McGill Daily here. And he would have brought his Jamaican folk, and their friendship was around Quebec folk, Jamaican folk. But was there something that falls in the same way that when you hear in Halifax, Helen Creighton going around all over digging up folk music, and she's also looking at Black folk expressions that come out of Halifax?
I am going to say that you're asked a question that I ask music historian constantly. Montreal was one of 3 or 4 major jazz, for a period of time, one of 3 or 4 major jazz centers on the continent. All right?
What were the others?
Chicago, New York, and New Orleans. All right? So there was a time Montreal rivaled those, right? And this is Harlem moving north and becoming a space for Black jazz in a way that would have rivaled some of the others, and they knew it. It really was that center. Okay. However, unlike the others, which were feeding into a population maybe 100 times more than Montreal, so you could record that, quote, sound, that New Orleans sound, that Chicago sound, that New York sound. We don't have a recording of Montreal, except for one record by Oscar. So when I ask music historians, what was that musical sound that defined jazz in Montreal? Tell me from the musicology perspective. What is it? They have no clue, because we have no evidence of it. And I just find that so strange. We have the remnants of it. So the people, we get the cameras in Montreal all the time looking for Black jazz in Montreal. And really what they're capturing are the spaces, the location and the faces and the memories, right? But not the music.
Not the sound.
They can only capture what people felt about it, and they'll talk about it and its influence on people, sort of the legacy, the threads over time. But the essence of what that sound is, we have no record in Montreal. And that says something about Montreal, though, because there's no denying that we were jazz here, that we were one of the centers. So that's why I said they keep coming, even though they could do all these movies for 2 hours at a time, talking about Montreal and never once play a Montreal sound.
Do we know if
Wonderful.
anything exists?
Now, you talk about the Oscar Peterson record as being the lone example. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Didn't Andy tell you?
No, he didn't.
And do we know if there's anything in any of the archives in Quebec?
No, and no, and no.
Wow.
Because it just didn't exist. The population here was so small, right? You're going to press a record, you want to sell it. So you sell it to 3 million African Americans south of the border, and you're lucky if you sell it to 20,000 up here north of the border.
You had to cater to the market, in other words.
Well, I mean, it's a market, right?
Yeah.
Music is business.
Yeah.
I'm not playing that. It's
Yes.
music is, and I understand that.
Yes.
But you can understand why there wouldn't have been that rush. So we knew there were race records, and we see that evidence in the historical documents, right? But just 2 blocks from where I live was the RCA, the company that would have pressed the records.
The label,
And there
yes.
was another company just south, all in the southwest of Montreal. And so they were literally within walking distance of the center of the jazz. But there was no need, right? And the guys that were doing that phenomenal jam that they keep talking about, right? That was all happening after hours. That was after the jazz.
Clubs
That's
closed.
right, after the clubs downtown closed,
Yeah.
right? So these were impromptu, improvised jazz where masters were playing against each other. And apparently that was a sight to behold, but nobody was recording. We didn't have cell phones in those days. Nobody had a tape recorder or cassette recorder, and it would have been, it would have been up to those record companies that were developing how to press a record, how to get it to move, all of that kind of thing for recording. So I don't want to belabor the point, but I just find that such a fascinating aspect of jazz in Montreal and why it's so distinctively different. And yet at the same time, it had so many of the same elements that were going on in other places.
Interesting. There are a couple of beautiful quotes in your book.
You're on the same first question, eh?
As you quote one elder explaining, quote, "The music was the way we showed love to each other because a house was not a home until there was a piano in it." In moments in your book, it becomes clear that music was very much part of a healthy and loving family environment. What do you, Dr. Williams, what do you say about the relationship between the music business and music in the home during the 20s, 30s, and 40s for Black Montrealers?
Well, I think I explained that almost every home tried to either have access to a piano or bring a piano in their home. It was really an important component, and it was not unusual for kids as young as 4 and 5 to be trying themselves on the keys. You know what I mean? And so that was always part of our cultural manifestations, what we did in the community, because we wanted to develop at that time. The thinking in the community was to develop a rich cultural life. So, it was through theater, it was through dance, it was through music, and also through language arts. And you see that emphasis on having debating clubs and the Phyllis Wheatley literary clubs and stuff like that. The whole idea of building a Black culture, rich cultural life for the youth and for the
mind.
very,
Yes.
very much so.
Yeah.
So I see that the two coming together, but it was not commercial, right? These
Yes.
were done in individual homes.
Yes.
So
And I remember speaking with another pianist who has an Order of Canada, has Montreal roots, Halifax roots, Joe Seeley. He talked about the porters getting paid well enough to afford a piano that was in the home, and that was maybe an example of showing how you've arrived.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It was critical. And if you didn't have it, then you kept your connection to the church where you could go on the weekdays and practice. And then when the NCC, and that was the NCC, basically, it was really important. Or you made connections with people that had a piano next door.
What about radio? And, context is everything.
I understand, but you know what? I don't remember any stories about radio, to be honest.
Yeah.
Maybe it's because I never asked the question, but it also is never, I don't think anybody ever talked about radio as sort of feeding that that need for culture. They would have looked at radio or looked to radio. That's interesting because we're talking pre-TV world, right?
Yes.
So, yeah. No.
We have work to do, Spencer, to go and find out about radio in lives in Montreal and what it meant, particularly to the Black community.
Check out the work of Mary Vipon. She's you know what I'm talking about? She's a historian of radio. And she used to be a professor at Concordia, so you can find her work there.
Vipon?
Vipon, Vipond. She's probably, I don't want to say.
Oh, we'll see.
But,
Okay.
I got another question here. From your research, can you talk about Daisy Sweeney and the role that Black women played in Montreal's music history? 'Cause she was a giant in many ways.
I
never
think
recorded until.
No, she didn't record.
Yes.
She, I guess her claim to fame, if you could call it that, was being the sister of Oscar Peterson. But even Oscar would say she was a better pianist than he was.
Really?
Yes.
Really?
And
You're telling me. No, but you're telling me, Professor Williams, that Oscar would have been considered a prodigy. So we're talking about
Oscar was a prodigy.
two prodigies, right? That's what you're saying.
He was never shy to give acknowledgement to his brother, his older brother, and his sister, which in his mind were better at their instrument than he was. Now, maybe they weren't. I'm just telling you, you know how sometimes you have a perception of your brother or whatever, and they don't see themselves that way. He certainly saw her as being an example. She was part of his formation. We call that in Quebec, his formation, his training, his development, right? She was critical to that because she was the one that kept him from licks, and she was the one that gave him the structure to really develop that music. Without her, because his father was away 6, 7, 8 days a week, but he came home expecting him to be ready to play, to practice and show what he learned. And he did that through his sister.
And we also know from interviews with Oliver Jones, and there's a little, hopefully you can clear up the mystery, either Arlene Bourne or Eileen Bourne, who was their neighbor, who is a graduate of music here at McGill. It's Eileen. See, we heard two people and two different names. And she also, because she went to McGill at early days that she did and came out of the Bourne family that was an educated family, that she was considered the better player, so much so that she played with everybody, much to the consternation of the church, and played in clubs because she was a woman. She should have just been playing hymns. And so that is some of the information that we're just scratching the surface. We're trying to find recordings of her.
Ooh. What period? You're talking in the 50s?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have a picture of her at CTVM that
Possibly.
we're hunting down.
Yeah, you might be able to get a recording at that period of time. Much earlier, no, but yeah. Wow. That's fascinating.
That's some of the work we've been doing here and losing our minds over. So the role of woman indeed.
Yeah, I want you to talk about that because
woman in music.
Coming from Toronto, that is something that seems to be quite distinct here in Montreal in terms of the organizations, that came out of Montreal. I think you're right about a number of organizations in the 20s and early 30s, the UNIA being another example. But the women were the backbone for many of these organizations. Do you agree?
Of course.
Of course, she says. Can you expand on that, Dr. Williams?
You want me to go back to
Please,
the origins?
please.
Well, then I'd have to go back to the misogyny of the early 20th century. Let's be real. Because at that time, women, no matter how old you were not real persons. They did not have the right
The vote.
to sign for themselves, to make contracts. So creating an organization required male signatures. Now remember, the men are on the train 8, 10 days a week, right? In the month, sometimes as many as 25 days of the month. Who's taking care of the family? Who's taking care of the kids? Who's creating community? Who's trying to uplift and keep the community? It's the women, right? So the organizations, the exception UNIA, but the organizations that come together or brought together in the early Black Montreal are coming together from the efforts of the women that are left behind, right? That are sustaining the community. But to formalize that means they got to put a signature on a paper that's going to go to a registry office in the city hall, right?
And the men's
and they got to
signature was
wait
there?
for the men to come home to sign.
Wow.
And who, once they're gone, who's taking care to ensure that the goals and objectives that they've listed in these organizational papers are executed? It still has to be the women. Now, front and center, they'll put a man out. But even the church, when you think of the Union United Church and its uniqueness, so much of the early church was sustained by the women auxiliaries. A very, very many different women auxiliaries helped to keep that church going. I always laugh and talk about, white women in the 60s and 70s and 80s were fighting to be in the pulpit, and to influence. Black women were doing it in the 20s just for survival.
It was a matter of survival. In all your historical research, you've found that there exists a great deal of research between the 1920s and the 1960s, would you say?
Are you asking me if there's a body of literature, what I call a corpus? Yeah, of course there was. Although they'll tell you, or they did tell me when I was younger, that there was nothing written, therefore there was no history. Yes, I was told there is no Black history.
Someone actually said that to you?
Of course, yes, they did.
To which you said?
I said nothing. I was a 15 or 16-year-old, so I didn't say anything. They would get a different answer today. But also, in the meantime, I tried to make a point in my own journey to show that there is this rich written history. They just aren't looking at it. They still aren't, but they aren't looking at it. And so therefore, they didn't have a narrative in which to share with us as Blacks.
Now, you talk about how you being told that there wasn't a history as being one of the motivators for your life's work. Is this a true story about how it motivated you to doing the kind of research that you did?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And even to this day, I'd have to say, call it petty if you will. But I am still trying to show to the gatekeepers of knowledge out there, the teachers that I was with, that, hey, we have a history. We've always had a history. There's always been something written about who we are, maybe from their lens, but it's still there. That's usually enough to constitute a body of knowledge. And so I went through many, many archives looking for instances of us. Who's been writing about us? What stories are out there about us? And I put them together in my 2 books, Blacks in Montreal and The Road to Now, because I wanted to make sure that everybody knew there was always a history. It was never an excuse for not teaching it in school. It's still not an excuse today, even though it's not taught in school. Not taught in school.
What is the...
Let's
wanted to
take a
ask?
quick break. And when we come back, we'll continue with Dr. Williams. That okay? We cool with that?
The great Dr. Williams,
The
and you
great.
tuned in to CKUT.
90.3 FM, this is Boom Boom Time for those of you just tuning in or I'm wondering, hey, what's going on? This is the Takeover.
Definitely the Takeover.
And like, I was sat here thinking that Dr. Williams was going to come in here and tie it all up nice for us. And I'm afraid you've come and you've thrown grenades in our minds that we have so much more work to do. But let's play some music. A little Francisco Link right there by the Sobriquet Saga Boy, Tears of a Nation. And we are in the midst of the Takeover. In studio with me, Donna McCurvin and Phil Vassel of the Canadian Black Music Archives. Storm is in the house. Storm, is any of this stuff interesting to you?
She's working on it. She's working on it. She's working on it. I think the important thing, though, Storm, and any other young person that's listening out there, for us, for Donna and I, when we started the Canada Black Music Archives, it was important for our children as well. I have 2 daughters, Donna and I, and we felt that they have to see themselves when they look at Canadian history. And Michael Williams said something that was very interesting to me. I know of his history here in Montreal. And we had many conversations. And one of the quotes that I've taken from him is this. He says, Black music history is Canadian music history. And I think that is so true. The problem that I think Dr. Williams revealed is that there's so little scholarship in this area. And she's given us a challenge with this conversation here today that we got to go out and do some work.
Rapidly, I hear the ticking in my ears behind me.
She's laid the groundwork. I think you've laid the groundwork. Yes, you weren't dealing with music as a specific area, because all of this started out with demography work, is my understanding.
Yes, and that came out of an institutional request, because at that time, the Quebec Human Rights Commission was trying to figure out why Black people kept coming to them and saying, they won't rent me an apartment.
Oh, really?
And they kept, originally, what would happen is an agent would take the file, and then another agent would take another file of another Black person. Somebody finally one day say, wait a second, these are not isolated cases. What's going on in the housing market? And nobody had an answer. So they had Esmeralda Thornhill, Dr. Esmeralda Thornhill, knew of my work, which was in its infancy. I mean, when we look at where I'm at today. And she said, why don't you approach them? I've laid the seeds there, and see if you could help them to understand racism in the housing market, totally outside of anything I've ever done. So I sat down and I had a conversation with the woman who was interviewing for that. And I said, you know what? I can tell you what's going on in the housing market. I said, but I'm not going to tell you what's happening now, today. I said, I'm a historian. I said, I'm going to look at the roots of it. Why we have today, with the situation today, probably comes out of centuries of exclusion and social isolation. And she looked at me for a minute and she said, okay. And it was that affirmation from her, that assent. And I just started, because I was always a collector, I started going through reams of my books and articles and papers, and I started piecing together a narrative. So if anybody out there has Blacks in Montreal, not The Road to Now, which you have here, but the very first book, that came out of that discussion I had at the Human Rights Commission, the Quebec Human Rights Commission. And when I went back to her and I gave it to her, she read it, and then we had a further conversation. And she said to me at that time, so it would have been about 1985, and she said, I've read this and it cannot sit on our shelves. Everybody in Quebec should read this.
That's pretty bold of her.
Absolutely. And so, you know, just out of school, just out of my BA, I gave her the manuscript. And lo and behold, the book you have, the original book, Blacks in Montreal, is actually a book published by the Quebec Human Rights Commission. They felt it was so important to bring that story out. Not only did it serve their purpose so that now any agent, any person that gets a file of racism in housing, they can point to the book because the data is there. The information is there. It's rich with statistics. It's rich with data, okay? But also, it helps the agents to educate the judges who are adjudicating. So again, it's not an isolated incident. We have a narrative which explains why 200 years later, they're still not renting to Blacks. They're still closing the doors. There's still those barriers, all right? And it's laid out for them, page after page after page. Change the case, change the course at the Human Rights Commission because of it.
Was this happening elsewhere? In other places, other provinces? Because it seems like that was groundbreaking work.
Well, here in Quebec it was.
Yes.
Here in Quebec. The book was groundbreaking because of the effect at the Quebec Human Rights Commission and its impact, which was almost immediate, like an earthquake. But it was not the end of my narrative, which is why 9 years later, I put this together.
Book.
Because that was the demography. And for those of you listening, like, what is she talking about when she says demography?
Break it down
because
for us.
I'll break it down. I always break it down. I'm a teacher. Demography. When I'm talking about the Jamaicans came in between this year and that year, and they moved into Côte-de-Neiges, or they went into LaSalle, and then the Bayesians, when they came in 19 and they were and so I'm looking at it from a group perspective, right? I'm identifying some characteristics of them, and I did it by ethnicity. All right. And so that's what a demography is. So I called it historical demography when I was writing it, but the title eventually became an urban demography because I focused specifically on Montreal, not Quebec, right? Not the regions, but Montreal. So an urban demography. And so you can actually track it through that book, not this one, but Black books, a Black book that will tell you about the migrations of different ethnic groups coming into the city and their impact on the housing market.
So I want to ask, rooting it back into music, because we do know when a people move, I know of countless Jamaicans who, some of them bring seeds, some of them bring their favorite food. We walk with our food. We walk with our fashion. We walk with our music. We walk with our stories. And so much of this is not being preserved. How do we get individuals now to do that? And in particular, some of our elders and their kids who are taking care of elderly parents or dying parents to stop throwing away pictures, music, files, and get them to understand just how important these artifacts are to documenting not only our music, about our impact and our time here?
It would be absolutely wonderful if we had spent much more time as parents telling our kids to get into things like sociology and history so that we could track it ourselves. It was a great companion to my book would have been a study at when the Jamaicans went here, what stores open, what restaurants open, what Jamaican businesses came into that area. How did that have, what was the effect with other ethnic groups already in the neighborhood, you know, and how that changed the retail landscape in the city. That would have been a great complement and companion to that kind of, but you need that kind of scholarship and awareness of where the sources are. How do you track that? We don't. We spent a lot of time just saying, the ultimate, we want our kids to be doctors and lawyers, but there's so many other things that make a culture, that bring a culture together, richness of a culture, right? That we can identify. It's how we understand ourselves as well. So it's the music, and it's our cultural productions, but it's also our food. It's the festivals. It's the way in which we marry Caribbean, in this case, because of the dominance of the Caribbean population that came into Montreal, and the kinds of things that were merged and other things that remain distinct to each ethnic group. I mean, this is in and of itself is would be a great doctoral thesis for somebody interested in understanding how ethnicity is, inculcated within the Canadian, quote, mosaic or as you will. I think it's, there's so many opportunities still left to be told, and I love that, what you just said, because me, as an archivist, actually, that's a terrible start to the sentence. As an archivist, I feel it is so critical for us to capture the kinds of things you were talking about are called artifacts. Right? We need those artifacts because, again, they complement the written word, which is sort of one-dimensional, and you need the richness of that comes from cups and plates and the different artifacts, the remnants of when they had a store and they had this pot there and it did that or whatever. Like, it's so critical for us to understand that we may have artifact history in our own home, our parents' home. Why don't you capture that if you can? Right? But no, we don't. We're not thinking that. We're so oral sometimes.
I have to say it's more than a case of not thinking that, because from my own experience, when you talk about, the world of archives, a lot of people's eyes glaze over it. It's just not part of our culture. And if you don't understand it, then you don't understand why it's important.
But it's so sexy, though. I find it so sexy, and I God, this is what I've been doing at my low level in the last 3-4 years, right? And I can take you right back to when my mother passed, and the 5 sisters were going through the closet. We waited about 18 months and we went through it, and then with it came the stories. She wore this hair, you remember this and that and that, and oh, I hated mom and that and this and that. But then it happens with the records, the songs, Bhum Bhum Tyme. That was why we started the show. We used to say, we like to play the music that reminds you what you were wearing when, who were you dating, how long was your hair, right? So there is a sexiness, but it's for us to go and sell it. So what are some of the practical tips that you would say to the listeners right now? And I just sort of feel calm and feel that there's a quietness over the city and people are really listening today. Because usually when we have long form interviews on my show, 1 million people are texting me going, when are you going to play music? And I haven't gotten one single text.
Amen.
So I think we are doing something here. How can we talk about the music that we grew up listening here, the clubs, we started it here, but in very practical ways. And I guess I want to even go back to a time which, for me and for a lot of people, Expo 67 and the music that came out of there. I wondered, what could you tell us about the impact of Expo 67 on the Black community?
Well, I'd have to say that really speaks of your age, because I was a child. I mean, I was like 8 or 9 years old when Expo 67
I was
came out.
one, Dorothy. Leave me alone. You started.
I remember Expo 67 not from a music perspective, but the effect on the community. And I was right in the midst of, quote, that urban renewal. Didn't have the same effect in my world and in my community, because there was always that sort of contrast, right, between let's celebrate, we are the world, and the wonder of that and the joy of that, with we got to move again. They're tearing down our house.
Yes, you spoke at length about that in your book.
Yes, I do. So at that time, in prep for Expo 67, was really for us, for a lot of Blacks in the community, a period of trauma. Because they had to leave what for them were to be generational homes in order for the urban renewal to take place in the Southwest. Just for the people that are listening and may not be aware, when the Ville-Marie Expressway was built, it split the community, and it caused what would be called dislocation of hundreds of families, not just Black families, but the effect within the Black community was so significant because that was the core neighborhood. So you had Italians there, you had Chinese there, we had Finns there, we had French there. Well, they moved. They went to other parts of the community, other parts of the island, and joined other clusters that were part of their identification. Blacks in Little Burgundy, which was the home that had kept that jazz community to the east alive, they were the ones that really felt it in such a way that its identity splintered. And so you had at the same time that identity is splintering in that physical neighborhood, which today we call Little Burgundy, but it wasn't called Little Burgundy in those days, but which splintered. At the same time, you got hundreds of West Indians getting off the plane, but they're not going into the old traditional neighborhood.
Yeah.
They're going elsewhere because there's no housing there, and it is a totally different environment.
The university ghettos. That
Totally. And they had no, even today,
connection.
They never went into Little Burgundy because it didn't exist for them. And so, yeah, that really changed the way in which we look. So now, I think for some people, it's always brand new to be talking about jazz, to be talking about that music era, which happened, 2-3 decades earlier, because they didn't come into it and embrace it. It wasn't part of their understanding or their historical reality in the city.
As an outsider, I've read quite a bit about Little Burgundy, and it was the home of jazz and the Black community. What remains of that today? Because I've heard the word gentrification.
Yeah, you can call it gentrification, but I'm going to disabuse you of something right now.
Go ahead.
Jazz was never in Little Burgundy.
Now,
you got that sound? You got that?
Downtown.
It was never in Little Burgundy. You know where jazz was? And I want everybody to think. Just close your eyes for a second, all you Montrealers listening. You know where the Bell Center is?
Yeah.
That's Mountain in St. Catherine? Mountain in St. Antoine? Where was Rockhead's Paradise?
Right there.
Thank you.
Right there.
That's not Little Burgundy.
Where did Burgundy start? Guy?
Thank you.
Guy Street.
And goes east Atwater.
The west.
Oh, sorry, West
West.
Atwater.
Yeah,
Yes,
west.
you're right.
Yeah.
West Atwater.
So St. Martin and all those streets that way.
This was the bedroom community. Well, Little Burgundy was because this was the workers, right? So the workers left there and would walk over mountain, go Peel into, and they'd be around that or the Cafe Saint Michel and whatever, right? And they're only at that point, you're only 2-3 blocks from the CNR and Windsor Station. Right.
And then it continue east to St. Laurent and then up to St. Catherine Street. So that's where those clubs were.
I might tell people all the time, it wasn't in Little Burgundy.
Yeah, it's true, eh?
Yes, my friend.
Because when you think of it, it's such a... But it's such an easy mistake to make.
Of course it is.
Because people consider all down there and they see near
I've been disabused,
Burgundy.
Pat. Because all my thinking up until now was Little Burgundy was the heart and soul of
She's
the
right.
music
Because
scene.
Guy Street, you coming back soon, right? Because I'll take you down there. We'll drive around.
I want to go there because I've heard it's been, gentrified and, you won't even recognize it.
I have nothing to say because when I drive through in the summer and see the basketball court where we used to go to look for guys, and I see a whole bunch of Asians playing basketball, I said, okay, so much for that.
Times have changed. Okay, I know we're running out of time here, but one question I have to ask Dr. Williams is, I would assume you must have a great sense of pride in terms of the work that you've done. But in terms of what's left to be done, can you give us some pointers in terms of where the scholarship and the research should now be going? I mean, you've ran a race that is so incredible.
And what is the best archives in this city where we find us really? I have a notion, but I'll shut my mouth.
I do too, as an outsider, and I was told I have to go there. But then Andy told me that, no, Phil, the best archives is in Professor Williams' basement. True?
I have an archive in my basement. Yes, I do. Andy knows about it. He started working actually upstairs. But I did introduce him to my massive periodical collection of Black newspapers.
Yes, you have to see her do this presentation. That's the last time I saw you when we were at McGill.
Oh,
with Senator Cool.
Yes.
And she just had all these newspapers, and I went, being a publicist at the time, I went trippy dippy. It was wonderful.
Yeah, it's quite a large connection.
It warrants a tour in and of itself.
Well, I'll tell you, I had some people, I won't mention who, but I had people coming in from Library and Archives Canada who are interested in archives, and I brought them down into my newspaper collection, and their mouths dropped open.
I've been contacted by Library and Archives Canada as well.
But can we trust them?
I know what you speak.
Can we trust them only because I say this because I'm almost feeling like a hypocrite. But for a long time, and this was from Dr. Clarence Bain, send your papers, send them to Library and Archives Canada, send, and boxes of stuff. And he's been talking about that.
And they're there. He sent his archives there.
And Concordia as well, right? Mm-hmm. But then we had Harris, and he closed a whole bunch of stuff, and we're seeing that happening to the south of us now. What is the responsible way to preserve these precious artifacts? How can you do it?
Very good question.
That's a very good question. Well, I think until we as a community can understand the value of archives in terms of leaving a legacy for our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, we need to, I think, rally around the archives that we have and continue to expand them. I think not just the periodical collection that I have, but the other materials will become so valuable. We're enriching them all the time, or what I said yesterday when our volunteers came together, we're enhancing them. I think it's really important that people are aware that those archives are there and that they continue to contribute their documents. I'll tell you who makes me cry. What happened to the Happy Wanderer?
Listen, baby, off air, I'm going to tell you about that story, okay?
I'm
Leroy the Happy Wanderer, bon vivant par excellence.
I'm not from Montreal, so Donna's sitting here. We want to know.
Bon vivant from Trinidad and Tobago worked as early as the mid-50s at Air Canada.
Yes.
Flew all over the world, but he was a photographer. And he took everybody's picture, every wedding, every cultural event, everything, and wrote poetry and hung out at the Ritz and the Queen Elizabeth and Kontiki. Oh, those drinks and the coconuts at the Kontiki. And took pictures there. He had like 5 prime ministers' photos. Everybody knew him. And then he died, and the materials were part of a family dispute. Which, as I said, I'll tell you, there's sunrise. There's sunrise. Finish your interview, Phil. Look at her face.
Are you kidding me? They identified he had at least 100,000 pictures. I know he had more. I tried working with him for those pictures, right?
We all did.
All right. So I know I wasn't the only one to put in a little in his ear. But no.
Well, look. Finish your interview, Phil.
Oh, my.
Music.
Finish.
Well, listen.
I think we've just really troubled our ants' nest. I think you're going to be here at this station more and more and more and more.
Well, here's my question. I'm getting there. I think, I'm going to say this. I think we're due for another book, Dr. Williams.
Great segue. I'm looking to republish The Road to Now.
Please.
This coming Black History Month.
Good. You heard it on Boom Boom Time first.
And,
yes.
And we want to send you a personal invitation to Toronto for a book launch of the republishing of this.
Oh, thank you.
It's been documented. I'll witness it.
Okay. All right. So you want me to go to Toronto? You think they'd be interested?
Do I think they'll be interested? What are you saying?
She's a Montreal treasure,
Did I
Phil.
say she's one of one?
Whoa, Nelly. She belongs to Montreal, them Toronto big people coming here to steal our people.
We can share her.
All right.
She's one of one.
All righty.
Okay, so
Alrighty.
let me say a million thank you for taking the time out. I know you had some meetings you had to get to today, and it certainly wasn't easy getting you here. Montreal is in a state of reconstruction right now, from what I can tell. But we can't thank you enough for breaking it down for us. You were a true legend. I'm going to call you that. And we really appreciate the time you've taken to educate us on Montreal's Black history, not just Black music history. I like to say the music exists within a context, always a context. And it was important to have Professor Williams say to us that, yeah, but there was this and there was that, and complicating it in some ways, but in a good way. And we really respect and appreciate you for that.
I want to ask you, did you have fun?
Yeah, actually, I did have a lot of fun. This to bring all of this out. Good practice, because I'm teaching this starting the 5th of September at Concordia in my course. I teach a course called Black Montreal. It's the only course taught in Canada on Montreal's Black community. And part of what I teach, because it's not really a history course, is I teach about the arts. I teach about music. I teach about sports. I teach about the embellishment of the Montreal Negro. I teach about slavery. I teach it all.
Could that be recorded and put on YouTube?
Oh, I'm not sure what belongs to the university and what doesn't. But that's interesting because you're not the only person that's asked if it could be a course online.
And is there carnival in that? Montreal Carnival?
Interestingly, it's an 11-week course. We can never get past the Sir George Williams, 1969. So we start at 1608-ish, and we go up to 69, and usually we're at the last class of the course. It's only a 3-month course. So, the 11 weeks that we actually work on the history doesn't give us that time to go into the 70s, 80s, 90s. No, unfortunately.
On behalf of the listeners who, as Pat has said, wasn't lighting up her phone about playing music, seems like we have done what we needed to do. Would you agree?
I think so, and I'm glad that we had the foresight to have her on the last day as opposed to the beginning, because it sums up the last 4 days quite nicely.
Dr. Williams, you're a treasure. Thank you very much.
And thank you.
We're going to play some music right about now. This is Renee Lee. We'll be talking to Renee Lee in just a few minutes.